Welcome, traveler of time. You've entered a realm where kings rise, empires fall, and every crown carries a curse. Today, we journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating monarchs, where love, power, and destiny intertwine. But the crown in this story is not gilded in gold, nor heavy with jewels. Its weight is forged from ideas, from fervent belief in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Paris, the beating heart of a restless France in 1794, quivers beneath the storm of revolution. Its streets run with both hope and dread, its citizens torn between visions of freedom and the specter of terror. Amid the clamor, one man rises, a figure both revered and feared, a prophet of virtue whose unwavering principles would ultimately lead him to the guillotine. His name, Maximilien Robespierre. Born in 1758 in the quiet northern town of Arras, Robespierre's life seemed destined for obscurity. Yet from the earliest moments, he exhibited a mind restless with ambition and morality. Orphaned young, he found refuge in books, his companions the words of Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. He absorbed their visions of society, liberty, and the role of reason in human affairs. The ideas he embraced as a boy would become the architecture of a revolution, a blueprint for freedom and equality. Yet, as with all architecture, its foundations could not bear the weight of human passion and fear. Robespierre's rise did not come from wealth, from connections, or from inheritance, but from a combination of intellect, principle, and relentless moral discipline. By the time France convulsed under the first waves of revolutionary fervor in 1789, he had honed his voice, sharpened his arguments, and steeled himself for the stage upon which history would judge him. While the elite debated and maneuvered, he emerged with clarity. The people, not the monarch, were the true bearers of power. The people are everything, he would declare. The king is nothing without them. His words, though simple, carried a weight that resonated across the nation. Some heard them as a call to arms, others as the tremor of a coming storm. And indeed, the storm was imminent. Bastilles were taken, noble privileges dismantled, and an ancient order crumbled under the collective roar of the oppressed. Robespierre's reputation as the Incorruptible was not simply a matter of rhetoric. It was a reflection of his austere life. He shunned material wealth, refused bribes, and lived with a discipline that was almost monastic. Yet behind this serene exterior burned an intensity that unsettled those closest to him. Friends, allies, and even casual observers sensed that his moral compass, while steadfast, could also harden into an unyielding and merciless rigidity. By 1792, as the monarchy teetered and France found itself at war with both foreign powers and internal dissent, Robespierre had become a central figure in the National Convention. His vision of justice and virtue was unambiguous. The monarchy must fall, and the republic must rise from its ashes. When the guillotine claimed the head of Louis XVI, Robespierre's influence swelled. He was no longer merely a voice of reason. He was a force shaping the destiny of a nation. Yet, even at the pinnacle of his early ascendancy, shadows stretched long. For every cheer in the streets of Paris, for every decree ratified in the halls of the convention, whispers of dissent and fear began to circulate. Some questioned the morality of execution as a tool of justice. Others feared the concentration of power in the hands of one man whose vision brooked no compromise. And therein lay the irony. The very virtues that propelled Robespierre to greatness, his integrity, his idealism, his unwavering commitment to principle, would also sow the seeds of his downfall. His insistence on moral purity, his intolerance for hesitation, and his vision of an incorruptible republic created enemies as swiftly as it inspired devotion. As the revolution consumed its own, few could have imagined that the man who had so often spoken of justice and equality would himself become a target of the very terror he once wielded. In these opening moments of our tale, we must ask, how does a man devoted to the highest ideals of liberty and justice come to stand at the center of fear and bloodshed? How does incorruptibility become tyranny? And how does the pursuit of virtue become a weapon against one's own people? These are the questions that surround Robespierre's downfall, questions that echo through history with a resonance both tragic and inevitable. As the city of Paris teeters on the edge of chaos, And as the revolution marches forward, one truth becomes clear. Power, no matter how virtuous its origin, is never without its peril. Robespierre's story is not merely that of a man, but of a nation grappling with the unsteady scales of justice, liberty, and mortality. His life, his choices, and his ultimate demise form a narrative that is as dramatic as it is cautionary. A tale of ambition and principle, of idealism and terror, of a crown not of gold, but of revolutionary destiny. Tonight, traveler, we step into this world of shadow and light, of hope and fear, and witness the first breaths of a legend, a man who would rise to shape an empire, and whose fall would mark the turning point of a revolution. The story of Robespierre's downfall begins not with violence, but with ideals, and with the quiet certainty of a man convinced that he alone could steer history toward virtue. As the streets of Paris stir and the guillotine stands ready in the dawn, we prepare to follow Robespierre from the purity of principle to the precipice of terror, a journey where every choice, every word, every act carries the weight of life and death, and where history itself becomes the silent witness to the fate of one man and a nation in revolt. The revolution is coming, and with it, the inexorable path to Robespierre's downfall. Before the roar of the guillotine and the shadow of terror, there was ambition, quiet, deliberate, and relentless. Maximilien Robespierre's early life, rooted in the modest town of Arras, was marked not by privilege, but by a hunger for knowledge and moral certainty. His father, a lawyer, died when Robespierre was only a child, leaving him in the care of his mother and, later, a strict schoolmaster whose lessons emphasized reason, discipline, and the value of a principled life. These early experiences shaped a mind both disciplined and unyielding, one that would later navigate the tumultuous waters of revolution with an intensity few could match. Books became his sanctuary and his compass. Rousseau's Social Contract revealed to him the power of collective will, the idea that society itself could shape virtue and equality. Montesquieu's Reflections on Governance offered him the architecture of law and structure, while Voltaire's wit and criticism of injustice fanned the flames of moral indignation. Each text became a stepping stone, each idea a weapon in the ideological arsenal that would one day define his political life. Robespierre's adolescence was a study in contrasts. Outwardly modest and unassuming, inwardly consumed by intellectual rigor and the search for justice. By the time he entered the University of Paris to study law, his reputation as a disciplined and principled thinker was already forming. He was admired by professors and peers alike for his eloquence, yet also regarded with unease for the rigidity of his convictions. Where others saw nuance, he demanded clarity. Where others wavered, he insisted on moral rectitude. As France lurched toward the precipice of revolution, these qualities propelled him from provincial obscurity into the turbulent world of national politics. The Estates General of 1789 would be his first stage, a place where the fate of a nation hung in the balance, and where words could ignite fury or inspire loyalty. Robespierre arrived with a calm resolve, a man of ideas armed with principle, ready to confront centuries of entrenched privilege and corruption. He quickly aligned himself with the Jacobins, a faction of like-minded radicals committed to liberty, equality, and the overthrow of monarchy. Here, Robespierre's voice found its echo. He spoke not with flamboyance, but with precision, each phrase measured, each argument sharpened like a blade. The people listened, the chamber murmured. His call for the abolition of aristocratic privilege and the establishment of a republic resonated deeply with the masses who were tired of feudal burdens, famine, and injustice. In these early years, Robespierre learned the mechanics of power, the subtle art of influence, and the dangerous currents of political intrigue. He witnessed the fall of old allies and the betrayal of those who claimed to share his ideals. Yet, instead of faltering, he honed his strategy, carefully cultivating both a moral image and a network of supporters. To his followers, he was incorruptible. To his enemies, he was unyielding and dangerous. The pivotal moment came with the storming of the Bastille. Though Robespierre was not among the masses who breached the prison walls, he emerged as a voice of reason and moral authority in the aftermath. He framed the violence not as chaos, but as a necessary step toward justice. Liberty, he proclaimed, cannot be secured without courage, without sacrifice, without vigilance. These words positioned him not merely as a participant in revolution, but as its moral compass, guiding the fervor of the populace with a steady hand and an unshakable vision. By 1792, France was at war with itself and its neighbors. Monarchies across Europe looked to crush the fledgling republic, while counter-revolutionary forces stirred unrest within the cities. Robespierre's influence grew alongside the turmoil. He emerged as a central figure in the National Convention, advocating for the execution of the king not from personal ambition, but from what he perceived as moral necessity. He argued that the survival of the republic required the eradication of tyranny, and he articulated this vision with clarity and conviction. His unwavering dedication earned him both admiration and fear. Citizens of Paris praised him as the Incorruptible, a man of virtue whose personal life mirrored his political ideals. He lived modestly, rejected wealth, and avoided the corruption that ensnared so many of his contemporaries. Yet, behind the stoicism, there was an intensity, a fire of conviction that could burn as fiercely as it inspired. Allies whispered that his moral absolutism could become rigidity, and his enemies warned that idealism without restraint could transform into tyranny. Despite these warnings, Robespierre continued his ascent. He recognized that the revolution was not merely a political struggle, but a moral war. He framed each decision, each speech, each decree as a battle for virtue itself. And as he rose, so too did his sense of destiny. He was no longer just a man among many. He became a symbol of the Republic, an embodiment of the ideals for which France was willing to fight and ultimately willing to die. In this period of triumph and moral certainty, Robespierre's vision was both inspiring and perilous. He believed in the incorruptibility of principle and the ultimate righteousness of the Republic. Yet, in a city where fear and ambition intertwined, where the passions of millions could turn swiftly from loyalty to fury, even the strongest moral compass could become a beacon for enemies. By the end of this stage, Robespierre had transformed from a provincial lawyer into a national icon. His intellect, integrity, and oratory had positioned him at the center of power, commanding respect and awe. He was poised not merely to influence history, but to shape it entirely. Yet, as history has shown time and again, the higher one climbs, the farther one can fall. And for Robespierre, the ascent that began with ideals of liberty, equality, and virtue would soon encounter the shadows that lurk within all power: suspicion, envy, and the unrelenting cost of absolute authority. The rise of Robespierre, the Incorruptible, was a story of intellect, principle, and ambition. But in its brilliance lay the seeds of peril. For in a revolution fueled by fear, blood, and passion, even a man of virtue could become a figure of terror, a symbol of the moral contradictions that haunt every epoch of upheaval. His ascent was unstoppable, yet fragile, and the stage was set for a conflict that would define not only his life, but the fate of a nation teetering on the edge of chaos. Power is a crucible, and in the fiery heart of revolution, it burns with a heat that purifies and destroys alike. By 1793, Maximilien Robespierre had ascended to the pinnacle of influence, sitting at the helm of the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-man council entrusted with steering the young republic through perilous waters. France was besieged, both by foreign armies seeking to crush its revolution and by internal uprisings challenging its fragile authority. In this chaos, Robespierre saw not merely a battlefield, but a moral arena. The republic must be defended at any cost, and virtue must be enforced with iron resolve. It was here that the concept of the reign of terror took shape, a policy as merciless as it was principled. To Robespierre, terror was not cruelty. It was justice, swift and impartial. Terror, he proclaimed, is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. The words, lofty and philosophical, masked the grim reality. Thousands would die in the name of moral perfection. Robespierre's vision of virtue demanded absolute adherence. Every whisper of dissent, every hint of counter-revolutionary sentiment, was a threat to the Republic's survival. Former allies who questioned his methods, like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, found themselves ensnared in the very machinery of justice they once helped to create. Danton, once a charismatic revolutionary and mentor figure, was accused of corruption, condemned by the tribunal, and executed. Desmoulins, the eloquent journalist who had championed moderation, met the same fate. Each death served as a reminder. No one, not even the revolution's architects, was immune to the logic of virtue enforced through terror. Within the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre's dominance grew, and with it, unease among his peers. His moral authority was absolute, yet isolating. He demanded loyalty not just in action, but in thought. Members of the Jacobin Club, once united by ideology, began to fear the man whose ideals were as inflexible as steel. Robespierre's refusal to compromise, his conviction that virtue required perfection, positioned him as both savior and tyrant. He was the hand that guided France's moral compass, and simultaneously, the hammer that struck those who faltered. The streets of Paris mirrored the turbulence of the halls of power. Citizens, once inspired by promises of liberty, now whispered in fear. The Revolutionary Tribunal read names from lists that seemed endless. Some were guilty, some innocent, but all could die. The guillotine, its blade gleaming under the morning sun, became an instrument of both justice and spectacle. Robespierre himself rarely appeared in public during these executions, yet his presence was felt in every calculated stroke, every decree issued, every name condemned. His authority was invisible, omnipresent, and absolute. In the midst of this, Robespierre sought to elevate virtue from political necessity to a quasi-religious ideal. The cult of the Supreme Being, introduced in 1794, proclaimed the divinity of morality and reason. In an elaborate festival in Paris, he appeared atop a stage adorned with flowers, draped in a sky-blue coat, embodying the moral rebirth of the Republic. Thousands gathered to witness this display, some in awe, others in silent trepidation. Robespierre was no longer merely a man of principle. He was the embodiment of the revolution itself, a living symbol of virtue as law. But the seeds of Robespierre's downfall were sown in these very moments of triumph. The festival, intended to inspire and unite, instead alienated many of his supporters. Whispers spread. Had he elevated himself above the people, above the nation, even above the republic he claimed to serve? Allies began to question his intentions. Rivals began to plot. The same moral clarity that had guided France to victory now became a blinding rigidity, one that refused compromise, one that inspired fear even among the faithful. Robespierre's speeches grew longer, more impassioned, more divine in tone. He denounced conspiracies and corruption, but often failed to name names, creating unease even among those aligned with him. The revolution, once a collective endeavor, now revolved around a single figure whose moral authority was unquestioned, yet increasingly resented. His vision demanded obedience, and his silence in the face of criticism became as threatening as any decree of the tribunal. Outside the halls of power, the people of Paris felt the duality of Robespierre's reign. In one moment, they cheered the promise of virtue and equality. In the next, they recoiled at the unending executions and the pervasive climate of fear. Families whispered warnings, citizens hid their opinions, and allies pondered the inevitable question: could a revolution survive a leader so unyielding, so incorruptible, and so isolated from the very populace he sought to protect? It was in this crucible of moral extremity and political tension that the revolution teetered. Robespierre's unwavering pursuit of virtue had secured power, yes, but it had also created enemies, some from fear, some from jealousy, and some from the simple impossibility of adhering to his impossible standard. The revolution's ideals, once a beacon, had become chains. The hand of justice, once protective, had become a weapon aimed at every corner of society. By mid-1794, the city of Paris was a nation in suspense. The guillotine waited in place de la Revolution, and the halls of the convention buzzed with whispers and suspicion. Robespierre, steadfast and unrelenting, remained convinced that he alone could preserve the Republic's purity. Yet, as the storm gathered, it became increasingly clear that the higher he climbed, the steeper the cliff of his potential fall. Every victory, every execution, Every proclamation brought him closer to the precipice where idealism would collide with reality, and where loyalty would falter under the weight of fear. In the end, the Reign of Terror was not merely a political strategy. It was an ideology, a philosophy, and ultimately a trap. Robespierre's vision of virtue, through terror, solidified his power, but it also isolated him from allies, estranged him from citizens, and transformed admiration into fear. The seeds of betrayal and the inevitability of his downfall were already planted, nurtured by the very principles that had brought him to power. The stage was set for a cataclysm, for a moment when the ideals of liberty would collide with the consequences of unchecked authority, when a man once worshipped as the incorruptible would become the target of those he once inspired, and when the revolution itself would turn upon its most devoted son. By the summer of 1794, the streets of Paris were heavy with the scent of blood and fear. The Reign of Terror had reached its relentless apex. Thousands had fallen to the guillotine, and even those who had once celebrated Robespierre's ascent now whispered in dread. Allies he had elevated, praised, and guided now regarded him with suspicion. His moral absolutism, once the bedrock of his authority, had transformed into a symbol of unyielding tyranny. In the eyes of many, the incorruptible had become untouchable, but not invincible. Robespierre's refusal to temper his idealism alienated those who had once rallied at his side. The festival of the Supreme Being, intended to unite and elevate, had backfired. Citizens and deputies alike began to fear a man who positioned himself not only as the guardian of the revolution, but as a living embodiment of virtue itself. Murmurs spread through the corridors of the convention. Had he elevated himself above the law, above reason, above humanity? The first cracks in his power appeared not on the battlefield, but in the halls of politics. Members of the Jacobin Club and the Committee of Public Safety grew uneasy, uncertain whether to follow him or resist. Fear became the language of survival, and whispers of conspiracy grew louder. The very people Robespierre had once inspired began to conspire against him. It was the paradox of absolute virtue. Those closest to perfection often make the most dangerous enemies. On July 26, 1794, Robespierre delivered what would be his final speech to the National Convention. Standing before his peers, he denounced corruption, conspiracies, and those who would betray the Republic. But there was a fatal flaw. He did not name the supposed conspirators. Silence hung, like a guillotine, suspended over the heads of those present. The deputies, already uneasy, interpreted his refusal as a threat, a sign that they too might be marked for death. The atmosphere, once dominated by reverence, erupted into panic and anger. That night, the convention acted. A coalition of deputies, fearing for their lives and the survival of the Republic, resolved to arrest Robespierre and his closest allies. Yet the events that followed were chaotic and surreal. Robespierre and his loyalists barricaded themselves within the Hôtel de Ville, the heart of Paris' revolutionary administration. Armed men surrounded the building, and the city held its breath. The revolution, which he had guided with such certainty, now seemed poised to turn him into a victim. Shots rang out in the dark corridors. In the confusion, Robespierre was struck by a bullet that shattered his jaw. Blood poured from his mouth, silencing the eloquence that had once commanded a nation. The man who had shaped law with words, who had inspired loyalty through the power of principle, now lay incapacitated and vulnerable. No longer the master of events, he became a prisoner of the very system he had helped to construct. Dragged before the revolutionary tribunal, Robespierre faced judgment from men who had once considered him a moral beacon. There were no pleas, no negotiations, no hope of mercy. His allies were condemned alongside him, their fates intertwined with his own. At dawn on July 28, 1794, the guillotine claimed him. The blade, once a tool of purification and justice in his hands, became the instrument of his end. The revolution had devoured its most devoted son. The execution was swift and brutal, but its symbolism was immense. Robespierre's fall marked the end of the Reign of Terror and the conclusion of a period when ideals had been wielded as weapons. The city of Paris, exhausted and fearful, witnessed the collapse of a man who had once seemed invincible. The incorruptible was no more. replaced by a cautionary tale of ambition, principle, and the dangers of moral absolutism. Yet the tragedy of Robespierre's downfall lies not only in his death, but in the transformation of the revolution itself. The ideals he championed, liberty, equality, virtue, had been corrupted by fear and enforced through violence. Those who had survived the terror looked upon his demise with relief, gratitude, or even guilt, unsure whether they mourn a martyr or celebrate a tyrant. The Republic, which had sought to embody the highest ideals of humanity, had been consumed by the very machinery it had created. Robespierre's final hours were marked by confusion, pain, and isolation. Betrayed by former allies, abandoned by the people whose cause he had championed, he faced the inexorable logic of history. Every decision, every speech, every act of virtue enforced through terror had brought him to this point. The revolution had turned against its own, and Robespierre's downfall became a symbol of the peril inherent in power guided by uncompromising principle. In retrospect, the fall of Robespierre is both inevitable and instructive. A man devoted to justice, morality, and virtue, who sought to elevate humanity through the strict enforcement of principle, became the architect of fear and death. His downfall underscores the delicate balance between idealism and pragmatism, between moral certainty and the realities of governance. In his pursuit of an incorruptible republic, he demonstrated both the power and peril of absolute conviction. And so, as the streets of Paris quieted and the guillotine's shadow receded, the story of Robespierre's life and fall remained etched into the collective memory. He was the man who had sought to perfect a nation, only to be undone by the very forces he had unleashed. His death did not merely end a life. It marked the conclusion of an era, a warning that the pursuit of virtue without temperance can become tyranny, and that even the most incorruptible are vulnerable to the inexorable machinery of history. The Robespierre downfall was not merely the fall of a man, but the turning point of a revolution, a chilling reminder that ideals, when wielded without humility, can consume those who hold them, and that the pursuit of perfection in human affairs often comes at a cost that no one can survive. The streets of Paris grew silent in the aftermath of the terror. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice and virtue in Robespierre's hands, now stood as a chilling reminder of the revolution's contradictions. The republic he had sought to protect survived, but it emerged scarred, cautious, and wary of the idealism that had demanded so much blood. In this silence, history began to weigh the life and deeds of Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had risen as the embodiment of principle, only to fall victim to the very forces he had unleashed. Robespierre's legacy is a tapestry woven with complexity. To some, he remains a figure of admiration, a man whose incorruptible dedication to virtue and equality inspired generations. His vision of a society governed by reason, justice, and moral integrity continues to resonate with those who study the revolution, reminding us that the pursuit of ideals requires courage and discipline. Yet admiration is inseparable from caution. His rigid enforcement of moral purity, his embrace of terror as a tool of governance, and his refusal to compromise serve as warnings of the dangers inherent in absolutism. The reign of terror, once justified as an instrument of justice, is now remembered as a period when fear overshadowed reason. Robespierre, the architect of that fear, became both martyr and villain. His influence extended beyond the scaffold. It echoed through debates about liberty, governance, and the responsibilities of power. Philosophers, historians, and political theorists have long wrestled with his paradox. A man committed to freedom who became the enforcer of death, a symbol of virtue who inspired terror. Even the revolution itself bears the imprint of his ideals. The principles of equality, citizenship, and civic responsibility that he championed did not vanish with his death. They endured in the structures of the Republic and in the collective consciousness of France. Robespierre's insistence that virtue must guide power left an indelible mark on political thought, influencing not only his contemporaries but generations to come. Yet it is precisely the manner of his downfall, sudden, violent, and definitive, that shapes the cautionary lens through which history views him. Artists, writers, and chroniclers of the Revolution have depicted him in varied lights. As a saint of reason, a tyrant of terror, or a tragic figure caught between idealism and human frailty. Paintings of the Festival of the Supreme Being, the empty streets of Paris after the executions, and the final procession to the guillotine illustrate the duality of his life. Visionary yet vulnerable, principled yet unyielding, a leader of men and a prisoner of his own ideals. Each representation captures not only the events of his life, but the emotional resonance that continues to fascinate and haunt observers centuries later. Robespierre's fall also offers a lesson about the human costs of moral absolutism. By elevating virtue to a standard that demanded conformity, he created enemies even among his allies. Trust eroded into suspicion, admiration into fear, and loyalty into betrayal. His downfall reminds us that power, when combined with inflexible idealism, can isolate even the most virtuous leader. It underscores the delicate balance between principle and pragmatism, between vision and humanity, a balance that every leader must navigate if they hope to survive history's scrutiny. In the decades that followed, France would oscillate between revolution and restoration, monarchy and republic, yet the shadow of Robespierre remained. He became a symbol in political discourse, a warning against the seduction of power cloaked in righteousness, a testament to the dangers of sacrificing humanity for principle. Scholars debate whether his moral rigidity was noble or fatal, whether his vision of virtue was pure or delusional, but all agree that his life and death are inseparable from the narrative of the French Revolution. The streets he once roamed, the chambers in which he spoke, the guillotine that sealed his fate, all these endure as reminders that history is rarely simple. Robespierre's life challenges us to consider the costs of revolution, the fragility of ideals when applied without mercy, and the ways in which power can transform even the incorruptible into a figure of fear. His story is both an inspiration and a warning, a meditation on the interplay of ambition, principle, and human imperfection. Centuries later, the echoes of Robespierre still haunt the ruins of history. From the cobblestones of Paris to the annals of political thought, his rise and fall reverberate as a testament to the paradoxes of leadership, the peril of unyielding idealism, and the timeless struggle between morality and power. The revolution that he helped shape did not end with him, but it was irrevocably marked by his presence, his decisions, and his demise. And so, traveler, as we step back from the tumult of the streets, the thunder of speeches, and the shadow of the guillotine, we are reminded that history is both a mirror and a lesson. Robespierre's life, his vision, his terror, his ultimate fall, continues to challenge our understanding of virtue, justice, and human ambition. The man who sought to perfect a nation became, in turn, a cautionary symbol of the fragility of ideals when confronted by the complexities of human nature. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More untold tales of history await you.